Hello and welcome to a very special video edition of PC Gamer's hardware section. We're here on what's possibly the hottest day of the year in the only un-air conditioned building in PC Gamer Towers to show you how to do something that we bang on about every month in the magazine, and that's build the PC Gamer rig. We've sourced all of our components online, so we've saved ourselves a lot of money over buying off the shelf, and the only thing we're going to need to put them together is a screwdriver and a fair amount of patience. It's really simple. I'm going to bang through it quite quickly. It might take you a bit longer, probably up to about 4 or 5 hours, in fact, if this is your first attempt at building a PC. But just bear with us, pause the video if you need to take a break, come back to it later on, have a cup of tea, unwind, just have fun. The first thing we're going to do is put as many components as possible into the motherboard before we put the motherboard into the PC case. The reason for that is fairly obvious. There's not a lot of room in the case, and once you've screwed the motherboard down, it's quite easy to catch your finger on sharp metal edges for the hard drive cages, or shove a screwdriver through a PCB accidentally, something like that. So we're going to put together things like the CPU, the memory, the heatsink, and stick them all into the board before we actually put the board into the case. The motherboard itself we've taken out of its box, and I'm resting it on something soft. A piece of foam's quite good. The box that it came in is almost as good. What we don't want to do is put it directly onto the table, because as you can see on the bottom there's lots of solder, which is quite easy to break off if you start forcing components in whilst it's on a hard surface. We're going to start off by putting the CPU into the socket. That's the CPU. That's the CPU socket. There are several different types of CPU socket. The two biggest distinctions are between AMD and Intel, of course. Intel CPUs come with a flat base like that, and you can see all of these little gold pin connectors on the bottom. Each one of those makes a tiny circuit with the motherboard itself, and inside the socket you can see there are pins sticking up which connect with the gold connectors. AMD processors and motherboards do that the other way round. The processors have hundreds and hundreds of tiny pins on the bottom, and the motherboard socket has a lot of holes in it. One of the reasons it's easier to build an Intel system as your first PC is because it's very hard to break that. An AMD processor with lots of pins on the bottom breaks very easily. So that's the different types of CPU covered. The big question is, how do you attach it to the motherboard? Well, it's fairly straightforward actually. The socket itself is known as a ZIF socket. That stands for zero insertion force. Fairly self-explanatory. It means you don't need to put any pressure at all on the CPU to put it into the socket. The reason you don't want to put any pressure on it is because you don't want to break these gold pins. That would be a very expensive mistake to make. Basically, the whole motherboard would have to be replaced. On a AMD processor, of course, you break the pins, you have to buy a new processor. To put the CPU into the socket, it's a bit like a tiny jigsaw puzzle. You see these two little notches on either side of the CPU there. They line up with the shape of the socket here. There are two little plastic sticky out bits there. The CPU sits on top of the pins, lined up with those. You simply close the metal cover and then pull back the retention arm. That slots under there, and you're done. When the PC is switched on, the CPU is going to get very hot. Now the problem is that when processors run hot, they run slow and eventually break. So we want to draw the heat away from the silicon inside the processor and disperse it into the air inside the case, where the fans will blow it out the back. We do this using a device called a heatsink. This simply sits on top of the processor and draws the heat away through the CPU block here, up through a set of pipes and into a radiator array on the top, where a large fan cools it. It's all fairly straightforward. The only problem is that where the plate on the bottom of the heatsink touches the plate on the top of the CPU, it doesn't make a perfect join, and there are tiny pockets of air in the grain of the metal which can slow up the transfer of heat from one to the other. So what we're going to do is put a layer of liquid metal between the two, because that spreads out and fills in all those gaps, making the join more conductive. Usually, when you buy a new heatsink, there's a small layer of this liquid metal, which we call thermal paste, already applied to the base. We haven't got that on this one because we've been putting it on and off of CPUs for a few weeks now. So we're going to apply a thin layer of thermal paste from a tube like this. Well, kind of like this. This is how you buy it in the shops. However, because we need to make the layer very thin, we're going to be using a slightly more expensive type of thermal paste, which we can apply with a brush. This is even more liquid, and just simply paints onto the top of the CPU. Now the trick to applying thermal paste is that you need to get a very thin layer that covers the whole of the top of the CPU, but you don't want to make it too thick, otherwise you'll trap heat underneath the paste and the CPU will overheat. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. Some people say put a blob in the middle and squidge it down with the heatsink itself. When you're applying it with a brush though, it's very easy. You simply paint on a thin layer like this. So we're starting from the edges with this, but it doesn't really matter too much. Just try not to get it on the motherboard if you can, and simply paint it on in your best Rolf Harris style. So you've got a nice thin layer that covers the whole top of the metal CPU, like this. Once we've put the thermal paste onto the CPU, now we need to attach the heatsink. There are two different ways of attaching heatsinks. AMD heatsinks have a metal retention clip. Intel ones tend to use these plastic pins. They simply line up with holes that are around the CPU socket and push through to lock into position like that. Now what they don't tell you is that the pins swing through a 90-degree angle locking, and if you look very carefully you can see there's a little arrow on the top here. It's sort of counterintuitive. When the pin's turned in the direction against the arrow, it's locked. When it's turned in the direction of the arrow, it's unlocked, and you can pull it out of the motherboard. And just like putting the CPU into the socket, it's actually very hard to get this wrong. There are 4 holes, there are 4 pins, so we put the heatsink down gently, line the pins up with the holes and just push them in there so they're just in the right position. So, now once they're all in the right place, one at a time, push them in to lock them down. It's best to do this working in opposite angles, just because that means you get a nice even spread of force over the top of the CPU for spreading the heatsink, the thermal paste. And finally, there's the power supply for the fan, and that matches this little set of jumpers here on the motherboard. It's helpfully marked CPU fan. The last thing we're going to do before we put the motherboard into the case is fit the RAM. Now, just like with the heatsink, just like with the CPU, it's actually very hard to get this wrong. So long as you've got the right type of RAM for your motherboard, and this is a DDR2 based motherboard, so we're using DDR2 RAM, you'll find that there's a little notch in the bottom of the component which matches exactly the shape of the socket on the board. You simply make sure everything's in the right place and then gently push down till it locks in. You're going to need at least 2 sticks of RAM, and what you'll often find is that the different sockets are all colour coded, and in this case we need to fill the yellow ones first, but exactly how your motherboard works will be in the manual. So there we've got the motherboard, the CPU, the heatsink and the RAM all assembled over here, and over here we've got the case. Now obviously we want to put the one into the other, and the easiest way to do that is to start off by lying the case flat on its back. You'll probably want to do this on a soft surface so that you don't scratch the back of the case, and once it's down just pull all the wires out of the way so that you've got a nice clear area to work in inside. Now the one thing you will notice is that underneath the exhaust fan here there's a large hole, and that's where all of the external connectors on the motherboard are going to poke through. Now motherboards all come with what's known as an RF shield. That's cut specially to fit into that gap, and that just pushes in and locks, and it does serve a purpose. It's designed to prevent radio interference or affecting the components around the connectors. Most motherboards these days probably don't even need it. Once the RF shield's in place, the only thing you need to check before you put the motherboard in is that these brass risers are all in place. Now they'll match up with a series of holes in the motherboard. The screws that hold the motherboard down fit into those, and what they do is they just lift the PCB up off the back of the case so that it's not shorting out metal or metal contacts anywhere and damaging components. The motherboard itself, once all that's done, simply drops in, and you just line everything up with the RF shield and the screws, and once we start screwing that down it'll lock nicely into place. Once the motherboard's firmly screwed down into position, there's only one major component left to go in, and that's the graphics card. Now, this is what makes all the funky, flashy things happen on screen. Like the CPU, like the heatsink, like the memory, it's very hard to put it in incorrectly. The PCI Express socket on the bottom here has a connector which fits perfectly into the socket on the motherboard. All you do is line up the notch with that shaped socket, and it should just slide in like so. A little click and it's in position. Once again, we just screw it down using these back connectors here, because the worst thing is if components start sliding around, they can damage the connectors and sockets, and then you're looking at a dead PC. Now you can see that what we've got so far is starting to look a lot like a real PC. The only things that are left to go into the case are the power supply and the disk drives. But whilst you've still got a bit of room to move around there, it's a good idea to cable up the front panel connectors. That's things like the on switch, the reset switch, and the hard drive light. The reason is that they're connected using these tiny, tiny cables and ridiculously small plugs which fit over jumpers on the motherboard here. You can't even see them on the camera. Every motherboard's different, there's no standard way of doing it. You've just got to sit there with the circuit diagram and figure out which ones to push over which pins, like so. Once you've got the front panel connectors sorted out, the next thing we're going to put in is the hard drive. Now, a lot of cases have very fancy retention mechanisms for hard drives and disk drives, involve putting runners on the side of the drive so it slips in and out very easily. The case we've got is good value for money, which means it's also quite basic. So the hard drive here literally just rests on two metal runners down by the motherboard. And once the hard drive's in place on those runners there, all we need to do is just screw it into position. And that's very easy. We just line up the holes on the side of the drive with the pre-drilled holes in the case. And you'll find some screws inside the motherboard box, usually the smallest ones that are in there, which you can use just to lock the drive in place. Now, as I was saying earlier, a lot of cases do come with very nice mechanisms for easy release of hard drives. Unfortunately, this one doesn't, which means that to lock in the other side, we are going to have to take the back of the case off as well. It's a little bit fiddly, but it is worthwhile because around the other side, we've got quite a nice space here behind the hard drives for tucking away cables and keeping them out of the way. These are the cables for the front power connectors, which we fitted earlier. And as you can see, there's a couple of cable tidies there. We can lock away the SATA cables, the power cables, everything around there. And it just keeps things neat and tidy inside the case, but also helps airflow as the fans blow cool air from the front of the case to the back. The importance of that, of course, is the same as the heatsink on the CPU. That cooler components tend to work better. That's the hard drive fastened in. The process for doing the CD drive is, of course, exactly the same. It just fits into the slightly larger 5.5 inch bay, 5.25 inch bay even, at the top there. Again, you can see there's metal runners inside the case. This is just a cheap DVD rewriter. It slots in, slides back until it fits flush with the front of the case. And once again, you'll find inside that the brackets and holes should meet up quite nicely. So the final part of the build phase is to cable everything up and connect it together. We'll start off with the DVD and hard drives, and this is the data interface cable, which runs from drive to motherboard. It's called a SATA cable, and it just plugs into the back of the drive there and into one of the spare SATA slots down here on the motherboard. Right. So, do the same thing for the hard drive. Exactly the same connector. Doesn't really matter which one of these you plug it into for now, unless you're building a RAID array or something that requires specific connectors. Any of the SATA slots will do. So once the SATA cables are all connected and tidied out of the way, the very last component to go inside the PC is the power supply. Now, a lot of older cases have the power supply mounted at the top, but this newer design, putting the power supply at the bottom, is designed to help protect the PC in transit. That way, if the power supply does work its way loose, it's not going to fall the entire length of the motherboard and smash every component on the way. That just slides into position and we can lock it down with these thumb screws there. Getting 4 of them just to hold it nice and steady. Once we've locked the power supply down nice and tightly, all that's left to do is sort out this spaghetti mess of cabling down here. The first cable we're going to put in is the large 24-pin block, and that just plugs straight into the motherboard. It's a little bit fiddly because 4 of the pins do break away so that it fits the older 20-pin standard as well. It doesn't make our life any easier. There we go. Then we've got these 6-pin Molex cables for the PCI Express boards, the graphics cards. A lot of graphics cards only need 1 of these, but our Radeon HD 4890 needs 2. And one of the nice things about this power supply we're using is that it's modular. So if there are any cables that we don't need, like spare 6-pin Molexes, we can take them off and keep them out of the way. The hard drive and CD-ROM, DVD-ROM drive both use these long, thin SATA power connectors. Again, there's a little notch on one side of them so that you can't put them in upside down. They just plug into the back of the drive, like so. And the DVD hooks up in exactly the same way, like that. There we go. Right, then we're going to take one of these older 4-pin style Molex connectors, and that's going to power the case fans. So we've got one on top and one behind. They're factory fitted by the manufacturer, so they're all cabled in properly. And the very last power cable is this 8-pin one, and that plugs into an auxiliary power supply that's tucked away behind the heatsink there. So I'm just going to drop the case down so I can see to do that. There we go. And then the last set of cables are for the front-facing USB ports, the headphone socket and the microphone socket. These boxes just drop onto the motherboard again. You can see that the holes are cut in slightly different ways. They match the pin shapes in these plastic connectors on the motherboard, so you can't actually get them wrong. It's very useful. And that one goes in. So. And all that's left to do now is to put the sides back on, and you've got the PC Gamer rig. And there you have it, the PC Gamer rig. As you can see, we've put the sides of the case back on, fastened them at the back here with thumb screws. We've attached a monitor, keyboard and mouse. All that's left is just to turn it on. That button there. Now, on the first boot of a new PC, we need to enter the BIOS. With this particular motherboard, you do that by pressing delete at this stage of the boot process, and just give that a couple of minutes and we should be through to the blue BIOS screen. Some motherboards you need to press F1, some motherboards you need to press F2. Again, it varies from model to model. You'll just have to figure out which is right for yours. There we go. Before we do anything else, we need to install Windows, and to do that we've got to get the PC to boot from the CD-ROM. That's done by going over here to the boot tab at the top, boot device priority, and our first boot device we need to change to a Tapi CD-ROM. Now, if I just open that, I've downloaded the Windows 7 release candidate. Windows 7, of course, is released later this year, but if you get hold of this now, you can use it for 12 months, absolutely free, and it's as good as the real thing. So we come out of this by pressing F10. Yep, we want to save that. And now that should boot from the Windows CD that's in the drive there, allowing us to install Windows. So this is the setup screen for Windows 7. It's really very simple. All you do is change this one to United Kingdom or Trinidad and Tobago, if that's where you happen to be based, and everything else happens automatically. There's just one big install now button, and there you go. Wander off, have a cup of tea, enjoy yourself. When you get back, Windows will be installed onto the PC Gamer rig.